It's Wednesday, January 14th, 2015, and this is KBIA's Views of the News. Our weekly roundtable on media behaviors comes to you from the Futures Lab studio at the Reynolds Journalism Institute. I'm Amy Simons, and here with me are some of my journalism school colleagues, Jamie Gray and Ryan Thomas. It's been a week since the bloody attack on the staff of the French satirical newspaper Charlie Hebdo, and we're going to spend much of the next half hour talking about the global response, the Je suis Charlie movement, and those who are saying Je ne suis pas Charlie, I am not Charlie. We'll talk about who published the cartoons that so upset the radical Muslim cell that carried out this attack and who did not. And we'll talk about newsroom safety in the aftermath. Also touch on the coverage of Sunday's Unity March in Paris, which drew more than 1 million people, including political leaders from around the globe. And the disappointment some American journalists showed in how our nation wasn't represented. Earlier today, an estimated 3 million copies of Charlie Hebdo hit newsstands in French, English, and Arabic. That's far more than the normal press run of about 60,000, and it was sold out before sunrise. On the cover, a picture of the Prophet Mohammed holding a sign saying Je suis Charlie below the headline, Tout est pardonné, all is forgiven. Pardon my French there. The paper's attorney was among those pushing the surviving members of the paper's staff to go ahead and publish again within the week. Let's talk for a minute about what was on that cover. He was also saying that it would be a natural that the Prophet Muhammad would show up there. What's the message you're trying to get across?
Well, I think initially the thing is to show that they're still going forward, which I think is a natural reaction. We see that after a lot of different horrific events, especially when we're talking about terrorist attacks, this idea that you want to move ahead. And I think that that's something that is natural and also would be something we would see from a lot of different types of media had the same act been perpetrated against them.
Yeah, I think that it's evidence that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And regardless of what outsiders may think about the content, from within the organization, there really was only one response, which was to keep going, to show that Charlie Hebdo would not be extinguished.
And I think specifically when we're talking about what the image was and is that they chose, that was probably a very calculated message that they wanted to send, and not only say we're still publishing, but we are still publishing the types of images that were found to be controversial and that so angered that radical group.
So that immediate sellout, is that a success in spreading that message? Is that a show of support among the public in wanting to embrace this staff and what they have been through and the push for the freedom of expression? What do you think that's about?
I think there's a couple of things that stick out to me. One is probably, yes, support. And then the other thing is that you would be purchasing a piece of history. Mm-hmm. Anytime that there is a run of a newspaper after something that is historically significant, be it something from as serious as 9/11 to the World Series, you see a lot of newspapers sell a lot of copies. So I think it's partially support and partially a piece of history.
Yeah, I think all of the above wanted to be part of this sort of specific historical moment. The cover itself, I mean, I think, the fact that it's a depiction of the Prophet Mohammed notwithstanding, I think is still relatively demure given some of the other stuff that we have seen. But I think that there's, lots of things going on, wanting to be part of history, wanting to show support for freedom of expression and many more things.
So you've been listening to us talk about a cartoon. It's visual, but KBIA has made the decision to follow NPR's lead in not publishing either the cover of today's issue or the cartoons at the center of everything that's gone on in the last week, and even longer than that. It's a controversial decision that wasn't reached hastily. There are a lot of considerations that have to go into a decision like this. What are some of them? Let's share those with our audience.
Well, I think it's a very, very complex situation because I was trying to weigh up the pros and cons myself. And on the one hand, you've got sort of the arguments that you need to spread the risk around. You can't have sort of outliers like Charlie Hebdo. You need to sort of, if everybody takes a stand, there's strength in solidarity. There's also the journalistic imperative that audiences need context to understand the issue. That if you're reporting about something and audiences can't see what exactly it is you're reporting about, they've got to fill in that information themselves. And there's also the argument, I think, that if journalism is to sort of put its head above the parapet and take a stand on one issue, it should be for liberal democracy and the values that it stands for. On the other hand, in general, I find sort of publishing something because I can or because I have the right to offend is very weak ethical reasoning, and it needs to be accompanied with an explanation about the values of free expression and what free expression means to a democratic society.
And I think looking at this in particular, while you could see it, and I agree with kind of that weighing and that there are things on both sides of this, but when you look at when you already have a policy in place that you will not show depictions of the Prophet Mohammed, which is the case for many news organizations, they are still standing on that same policy when they're looking at these cartoons. And I would say further, there are satirical comedians here in this country that may say something. I was listened to part of what Bill Maher had to say about all of this, and I was thinking, would we air what Bill Maher has to say? It was controversial. It could be seen as anti-Muslim. In some ways, I suppose you could take it that way. So I was trying to weigh, would we show a clip of a satirical comedian talking about the same thing? And I would say generally not. And so that was sort of where I came down, is looking at how a news organization is going to carry their existing policy for this, and then looking at, when do you as a news organization air satire and things like that? Yeah,
I think it definitely speaks to sort of the blurred boundaries of the contemporary media environment. What is satire? What is journalism? I think we need to sort of not conflate the two, certainly. But when it comes to talking about journalism specifically, there is a sort of irony about this, that we're sort of maybe combating censorship by ordering journalists what to do. You need to show these images.
Almost a reverse censorship type of thing.
And that sort of makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Ultimately, I think that journalists, the decision-making nexus needs to be around, are we generating more light or heat by publishing these images? If we're shedding some light and we're aligning our objectives here with our function in a democracy, sure. But if we think that this is just going to cause problems, tension, inflammation, and not shed a lot of information, then I'm less comfortable with those kinds of decisions.
Well, Monday, White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said the best advice that the administration could offer to journalists and news organizations here in the United States is that they individually assess the situation and use good judgment.
But when you said no to Jim, you weren't making a risk assessment that there shouldn't be fear that if the New York Times or Bloomberg printed this cartoon, that we would all be killed. That you're not making a risk assessment when you're saying you shouldn't fear that.
No, what I'm saying is that individual news organizations have to assess that risk for themselves. Look, I might add that there are also journalists who assume great personal risk to tell these stories. And we've seen that some of these journalists have been captured by violent extremists who have carried out terrible acts of violence against them.
So the New York Times was among those choosing not to publish the cartoons. And Ryan, you laid out a lot of the back and forth, the pros and cons. And really, there is no right answer here. Whatever decision an editor makes, or a news organization as a whole, somebody is going to take fault with it. Mark Cooper is a journalism professor at USC Annenberg. And on Facebook, he asked New York Times editor Dean Baquet how many people have to be shot in cold blood before the paper ruled that it could show the images that provoked the killers, going on to call the decision an act of cowardness, not publishing those cartoons. Baquet responded and called Cooper's statement self-righteous, second-guessing, without considering the possibility of another point of view. Then he called him a name that we probably shouldn't say on the radio. Naturally, tensions are high here, and when we approach topics like this, we too want to take a look at all of the different points of view. At least we hope we are doing that on this program. I want to ask you guys, do you think Cooper's criticism is unfair?
It seems to me to be a bit of a low blow, a bit of a cheap shot. Whether that sort of justifies the editor's response, I don't really know. I was sort of interested. I saw online Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, was at some public forum, and he mentioned the fact that he and his editors on Twitter are being pressured to run images and the most extreme images, and he sort of compared it to an arms race, right? That you can't show this image, you have to show the most extreme image. That's what you need to show, and really that gets us nowhere, right? So if you have to think, are we showing the images because we can or because they serve a journalistic purpose? And what Rusbridger said The Guardian would apply its normal editorial values, its normal standards, and reasoned that this kind of normality, this sort of keep calm and carry on approach, I suppose, was the best way to respond. And it did show the latest cover, but very small and with a disclaimer, which I think on balance was the right approach.
Now, earlier today, Margaret Sullivan, the public editor at the New York Times, came out and said that she feels that perhaps the newspaper did make a wrong decision, that if there are people out there, and I don't know how many there really are, who are only getting their news from the New York Times, they won't have that context. And she, too, is calling now for a review of how that decision was made within that newsroom. Jamie, I want to ask you this. As managing editor at KUMU, how does proximity factor into this? If you're talking about a national news organization like the New York Times versus a local newsroom and a conversation that might go on there, say, in America's heartland.
Sure. Well, I think there's a couple of things here. One being that as a local affiliate station, like all local affiliate stations, we are getting our content from our affiliate. In our case, it's through NBC, who has also made the decision to blur out covers, to only speak of them, not to show particular covers. And it kind of goes back to all of those things we've already talked about. I think there is another difference in television, and at least usually in the local television format, which is that we do not have an editorial page. And I think that is part of the key argument here, because some newspapers have chosen to show the cartoons or discuss the cartoons in different ways on their editorial pages than they have on their news pages. In television, we in general don't have that. Now, when you go to the CNN level and you have some pundits and you have those types of people, there are some editorialized, more editorialized segments.
And we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the show.
I just think, on this local level that changes things a little bit. And what we are doing is essentially taking, the national coverage that there is and listening to the judgment calls made by our affiliate.
And when you bring up the idea of an editorial section or an opinion section in a newspaper, that's something that is sometimes a little too nuanced to the reader to understand the division that comes in between an editorial board and the newsroom itself, and how those are separate entities that in almost every case operate independently of one another within that single publication. You had also mentioned, Jamie, before the show that you had heard some of the editors from Charlie Hebdo voicing some disappointment that American publications had not taken a stronger stance to go ahead and publish some of these.
Right. Last night on the Rachel Maddow show on MSNBC, she had one of the correspondents who had interviewed and gotten some exclusive interviews with a contributor of Charlie Hebdo, and had talked to her about the fact that many American media outlets had decided not to show these covers. And she said something to the effect of that was pretty sickening to her. And the other thing that stuck out to me in watching the coverage on MSNBC, or listening to the coverage, I should say, was that a lot of people in France were unaware of the fact that some American media had chosen not to show these images, and that there was a pretty strong reaction from some people, and I guess also including some of the family members of some of those journalists, some of those cartoonists who were killed.
I think it highlights a problem of generalization about journalism and media, that there's great variation across countries and then within countries. So what may be acceptable in in France, even for a satirical publication, may not be acceptable ethically, I'm not talking legally, for a publication in the United States. And it still remains a judgment call for those editors.
I think that's what's interesting about all of this is it's another one of those cases that we talk about here at the journalism school, and I know you talk about a lot on Views of the News, is when journalists become a part of the story, and when journalists are expected to take a stance on this. And in this case, take a stance means publish the cartoon or don't publish the cartoon, and that's asking journalists to do something that we are not comfortable doing, which is to say what we think.
Because so often in our professional lives, we are making a point of separating our personal opinions, our personal beliefs. And I know that's something that I'm constantly working with students on doing and kind of reinforcing that message of we don't sign petitions, we don't change our social media avatars to whatever the current meme is in support of a certain cause or something like that. Yet this cause hit so close to home.
I had an interesting conversation with a student journalist probably a day after the attacks, and he had mentioned that he sees a lot of news anchors at the end of a story like that say, our thoughts go out to the people who are impacted by this tragedy. And he asked about putting that in the end of our story. And I said, no, we're not doing that. We drive a pretty hard line here at the school with saying that we aren't going to do those things, and at KOMU. But it was an interesting question that he had really keyed in on.
I give him a lot of credit for asking.
Absolutely. And it was we had a very big newsroom conversation about this. Do we say these types of things at the end of these types of stories? And we didn't, but it did spark a really interesting conversation.
Or how language matters, that it becomes one of those natural things as you're writing a story that you want to call it a tragedy. Well, of course we don't think it's a good thing that it happened, but to put tragedy inserts that bias into the reporting right there as opposed to a less loaded word, calling it a terrorist attack, or because somewhere somebody isn't going to think what happened was tragic.
And I think it does just go back to Jamie's earlier point about how in many ways print has it easier than broadcast, because even if you choose to use the image, you can have the image and then have an explainer in the editorial section by the editor or by a columnist explaining that decision. That's not a luxury you generally have in broadcasting.
It's hard because any decision that had been made here, it could have some real consequences. And we saw that over the weekend at the Hamburger Morgen Post, which reprinted the cartoons. People threw rocks and burning object, it appeared to have been firebombing, through the paper's windows. And in Brussels, staffers evacuated the offices of Le Soir, a French language newspaper that had done the same. We had told you earlier that White House Press Secretary Josh Earnest said that there was a need to assess that situation and make an individual judgment. But it brings up a real question of newsroom safety, not just for the publications that run the cartoons, but for everyone, including those on the ground covering the story. According to Eric Wemple at the Washington Post, CNN made a decision not to run these cartoons out of fear for what could happen to its reporters in bureaus around the globe.
I think it's yet again, and we've had a lot of these reminders, at least it's felt so, in the last year or so, especially when we talk about ISIS and the executions, and this, when you talk about, especially on the global scale, the danger that journalists face and knowingly face when they do these. And in this case, Charlie Hebdo had been attacked before, and I think knew they were angering people to a point.
And the editor said he knew that this was most likely going to be his demise, was that he was on this most wanted list and that he was a target.
Yeah, you sort of see, the Mark Cooper response is to say, well, it's all cowardice. I think that's a simplistic explanation. I think that the safety of journalists has to be taken into consideration, because if there is an attack and there are more deaths, that's a net loss to journalism, right? So I think it's very easy to be an armchair critic sometimes, and we shouldn't underestimate the human dimension of this.
Well, according to estimates, there were more than 1.5 million people at Sunday's Unity March in Paris. Throngs of them were walking through the streets carrying pens and pencils and Je suis Charlie signs, and they made their way through the streets. The image of the 40 world leaders standing arms locked with French President François Hollande will be one of the lasting images of the event. But missing from that line, any senior U.S. government official. There was no Barack Obama, there was no Vice President Joe Biden, no Secretary of State John Kerry. And as we hear now from NBC's Andrea Mitchell, Attorney General Eric Holder was in town, but he was doing something else at the time.
Talk to officials anytime the president or the vice president travels, and their presence could have inconvenienced those who did attend. But one former official said it sure seems ham-handed. Savannah?
And then real quick, Andrea, I mean, is this trip by Kerry now more damage control than diplomacy?
Sure, it's damage control. He has a very close relationship with the French. He spoke in French from the State Department when this all happened, but he was going to be in Geneva, showing up on Thursday, even though he's still doing very important travel in Asia right now. That certainly does seem a little bit after the fact.
Interesting criticism there from Mitchell, talking about using words like ham-handed, too late, too little bit too late. CNN's Jake Tapper also wrote a scathing piece that went on that station, that network's website, saying he was ashamed about the absence of U.S. leadership there. And that's not something we often see from reporters.
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things that stood out to me about this. I mean, first of all, Jake Tapper, he's not George Will. He's not Paul Krugman. It's not his role to pontificate or agitate. So that sort of sat a little bit uneasy with me. As for the substance of Obama's lack of presence, or from the administration's lack of presence. I mean, there's a double irony here, right? First of all, you have a March for Free Expression where several of the participants, Turkey, Russia, Jordan, Egypt, have pretty terrible records on free expression, civil liberties, and the treatment of journalists in these countries. And then you have the sort of less serious irony that you have people lining up to criticize Obama who haven't exactly been very kind about the French in the past. Strategically, I suppose it's a blow for the administration, and sort of plays into a narrative that the administration doesn't sort of think through the symbolism or the optics of these kinds of things. And while there may have been sort of very little policy practical value in attendance, it may have generally pretty good symbolic value.
I just think in general, kind of this topic of journalists weighing in and making a comment at the end of a story, it just doesn't in general come off very well for a journalist who then will go on to cover all kinds of things. I mean, our role is to present all of the facts, what happened. The president wasn't there. The White House says that part of it was lead time on security and a lack of lead time to prepare for security. And to leave it at that, and to let our viewers, our readers, determine, and not to add the little comment at the end.
Yeah, it makes Tapper part of the story, like you mentioned earlier, right? I could not care less what Jake Tapper thinks about this, to be honest. I want him to report what's happening. If I want somebody's analysis, I will go to an op-ed writer. That's their role to do that. It's not Jake's. Okay.
Well, we also talked a little bit about this before, Jamie, the idea of journalists showing support. 33 journalism professional associations have banded together to demonstrate their support, among them the Society of Professional Journalists, Online News Association, Radio, Television, Digital News Association, Investigative Reporters and Editors, and several minority journalist groups among them. But there are some who are saying, je ne sais pas, Charlie. I am not Charlie. Among them, a contingent at Al Jazeera. Most of this has come out through leaked emails. What's the general attitude going on in that newsroom right now?
In Al Jazeera?
In Al Jazeera, yeah.
Sure. I think in reading Al Jazeera's leaked email exchange that they were having a pretty good conversation, a good internal conversation. I think for me what it shows anyway is that there was a conversation taking place, and what are we going to do, which to me actually came off in a more positive way, looking at it from the perspective of a journalism professor that wants to know that newsrooms are having these conversations.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, when I read this, regardless of the sort of the outcome, what I see is an organization having a really spirited, a really robust discussion about this topic, around this topic, which I think is the kind of thing you'd hope for in a situation like this.
Okay, well, what do you say we lighten the mood for a bit before we go today and talk about the Golden Globes? It was a big night for the movie Boyhood.
All right, don't worry about it.
Wish we could use the bumpers.
You don't want the bumpers. Life doesn't give you bumpers.
Richard Linklater took home the award for Best Director and Best Drama for the film, which he produced over the course of 12 years, showing a boy's journey into manhood. And Amazon's Transparent took home 2 awards in the television category, Best Comedy or Musical, and Best Actor, Jeffrey Tambor, who plays Maura Pfefferman.
I would like to dedicate my performance and this award to the transgender community. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you for your courage. Thank you for your inspiration. Thank you for your patience. And thank you for letting us be a part of the change. Thanks.
A groundbreaking series, Transparent, is the one big takeaway from the Golden Globes this year. If you aren't paying for television, you're not seeing anything good, are you?
Well, I would like to dispute that as someone that works at an NBC affiliate with Blacklist, right?
Or let's throw this out here, because the one Golden Globe that was given was the Best Actress in a Comedy Series, which went to the woman who's on Jane the Virgin, which is on the CW, which is also a KOMU station.
But I think you're right. We're talking about, of course.
Sorry, throwing you a bone there.
I know.
Jeff.
Thank you, and I appreciate that very much. I also I enjoy Netflix shows. I like to watch House of Cards, like a lot of people do.
Orange is the New Black, another nominee.
And, the Amazon Prime, it's that on-demand binge-watching phenomena that you have now, and it's just the way that things are moving. But I think, a lot of TV, we're all kind of moving toward how can we get our product online in different ways so that people can consume their media in the way that they want to, and I think it's representative of that.
Oh, certainly. I think it's very indicative of industry changes, because if you look at the winners, with some exceptions, generally they are the pay TV kind of model. So if you want to be watching quality shows, at least by this metric, you're not going to be served by the networks, or at least served by the networks alone. And so networks need to be a lot more creative, a lot more nimble, instead of having, the 2.5 Men as their sort of comedy offering.
How much of that is because of the limitations that are put on the networks in terms of what might be considered obscenities or sexual or violent activity that is acceptable on a Showtime, on an HBO, on a Netflix, that isn't on NBC or ABC or CBS?
Sure. And I think that you just see a lag. I mean, if you were to compare network television today to network television 10 years ago, I guarantee you there's more sexual innuendo. There's more, all these different things. So the themes have gotten more adult in nature, if you will. So maybe that's just, kind of the lag. But does it stand for quality? I don't know where that line comes in. But I do think it's just so fascinating to see all of these different shows. And I mean, then you have, Downton Abbey. That does so well, and so I think that there's just a lot of ways you can consume your media, and yes, some of it's paid, and I think that it's just interesting. It's so fascinating to watch and see the quality that you can get.
I think the point about what's acceptable on cable versus network and so on, I think that speaks to sort of the broader sort of issue of regulation, and how the old distinction between between the networks, between cable versus online. I think that's going to be something that either the FCC or the Supreme Court at some point is going to have to wrestle with, because increasingly people are consuming media in different ways, and are those distinctions that we've held on to for a long time, are they even valid anymore? I think that's something that needs to be revisited.
Okay, well, thank you. That music means we're just about out of time for this week. I'd like to thank you for spending the last half hour with us. You can read more about the topics we talked about today on our links blog. It's under the Programs tab at KBIA.org. Like us on Facebook or follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ViewsOnKBIA. These are all great ways to watch and listen to our program again. Leave us comments, questions, see what we'll be talking about next time, and more. Our thanks to RJI's Travis McMillan for directing today's show, and to Pat Akers for handling the audio. Austin Federa is helping us out with some of our web producing. Next week, you'll want to tune in at this time for special coverage of Governor Jay Nixon's State of the State address, followed by a special edition of Intersection live from the Capitol Rotunda in Jefferson City. I'm Amy Simons. Be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we're back with you for another edition of Views of the News.